This episode of Ben Franklin's World is brought to you by Cornell University Press. As we've heard in many Ben Franklin's World episodes, historical work is collaborative. Not only do historians seek out the help and advice of archivists, librarians, fellow historians, and other scholars, they also seek out the help and advice of publishers like Cornell University Press. Publishers like Cornell have editors and staff who help historians fine-tune the presentation of their ideas and then help them get those ideas out into the world. Recently, Cornell University Press helped historian Wim Klooster refine and publish The Dutch Moment. The Dutch Moment chronicles the spectacular rise and fall of the Dutch Atlantic Empire during the middle decades of the 17th century, or what the Dutch like to call their Gouden Eeuw, or their Golden Age. Wim Klooster wants to know why the Dutch Atlantic Empire was so short-lived and how its existence impacted the wider Atlantic world. These are really important questions to explore, which is why Cornell University Press helped him publish The Dutch Moment. For more information about The Dutch Moment and Cornell University Press, click the link on the show notes page or visit benfranklinsworld.com/Cornell.
Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 109 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. We've all read those books. You know the ones I'm talking about. They cover the American Revolution or some aspect of 18th century Europe or North American history, and they bring up the idea of the Enlightenment. And in each of those books, it seems like the authors use the term Enlightenment to describe something different, an intellectual movement, a social movement, and sometimes a scientific movement. So, what was the Enlightenment, and how did North American colonists like Ben Franklin participate in it? Today, John Dixon, an assistant professor of history at the City University of New York's College of Staten Island, will help us explore the Enlightenment by taking us through the life and times of Cadwallader Colden, a participant in the Enlightenment and the subject of John's book, The Enlightenment of Cadwallader Colden, Empire, Science, and Intellectual Culture in British New York. During our exploration, John reveals who Cadwallader Colden was and why he deserves our attention, an overview of the American Enlightenment, and Colden's contributions to both the American Enlightenment and the history of colonial New York. But first, why not subscribe to the Franklin Gazette? This weekly newsletter places the show notes for each and every episode right in your inbox. Plus, by signing up, you'll receive the link to our private listener community on Facebook. Subscribing is free and easy. Just text BF World to 33444 or visit benfranklinsworld.com and click on the orange Join Now button. Are you ready to be enlightened by our exploration of the American Enlightenment? Allow me to introduce you to our guest historian.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, here is this week's special guest.
Our guest is an assistant professor of history at the City University of New York's College of Staten Island. His research interests include the early modern Atlantic world and cultural and intellectual history. He joins us to discuss the Enlightenment with details from his book, The Enlightenment of Cadwallader Colden, Empire, Science, and Intellectual Culture in British New York. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, John Dixon.
Thank you, Liz. It's really great to be here.
John, Cadwallader Colden isn't exactly a household name. He's probably only familiar to those who study and read about early New York history. So, would you provide us with an overview of who Cadwallader Colden was, when he lived, and why you wanted to write a book about him?
Cadwallader Colden, he was a prominent politician and intellectual in 18th century British New York. He was a Scot. He might have been born in Ireland or Scotland, but he spent his childhood in Scotland. And he was born in February 1688, the year of the Glorious Revolution. And he lived all the way through then to September 1776, at the outset of the American Revolution. And he grew up in southern Scotland during quite a traumatic time in Scottish history, the 1690s. It was a decade of great economic distress and sectarian violence and outmigration in Scotland. But Colden endured that period, and then he entered the University of Edinburgh in the early 18th century, and he got what would have been a very good and really quite advanced education there at the University of Edinburgh, and that would have included some exposure to the ideas of Isaac Newton. And after he graduated from Edinburgh in 1705, he decided to leave Scotland, and he initially went to London and tried to become a physician. He was unsuccessful in that, but he was quite an ambitious personality, and he was very keen to enhance his wealth and his social position. So he moved on to Philadelphia in 1710, and then from there he moved on again to New York, and he arrived in New York in 1718. And he lived in New York then from 1718 until his death in 1776. And he pretty much settled there. He established a farm that he called Coldingham in Ulster County in upstate New York. So he very much became a New York figure. And his political career took off very quickly in New York. By the early 1720s, he had a position as New York Surveyor General. And this was at least potentially a very powerful and lucrative position. By the early 1720s, he had also become a member of the Provincial Council of New York. And he held both of these positions as councillor and as Surveyor General for decades. And he eventually worked his way up to becoming Lieutenant Governor or Lieutenant Governor of New York. And he held that particular role throughout the 1760s up until his death in 1776. So he was really a major political player in colonial New York. And at the same time, he managed to establish himself as one of the most important intellectual figures, not just in New York, but in all of British America. And he had really wide-ranging intellectual interests, and he made significant contributions in a number of areas, including cartography and botany in particular, and astronomy and mathematics, and certainly physics and moral philosophy and history. And I would say just as significantly, he also helped to create an infrastructure of sorts that allowed an acceleration of scientific ideas and information and books and plant specimens to circulate between different parts of British America and also between the Americas and Europe in the mid-18th century. And Colden did this mainly through his correspondence, but he also showed a lot of interest in print culture and the use of print to spread Enlightenment ideas or scientific ideas. And he also offered advice and help to people such as Benjamin Franklin as they tried to organize philosophical societies and journals in the colonies in the middle of the 18th century. So I guess overall, Colden was, very integral to the emergence and development of New York and American and really transatlantic scientific and intellectual culture in the middle of the 18th century. And it was really that aspect of Colden's life that I wanted to explore when I set out to write my book. And I wanted to explore not just Colden's ideas as an intellectual, but also the social and the political and the broader cultural world in which he operated as an intellectual. And I guess I thought a book on Colden like that was worthy because Colden really draws attention to aspects of the Enlightenment, particularly the American Enlightenment, that are quite understudied. Certainly the role of New York is one of these, so I was interested in examining how intellectual culture took hold in early New York and to what extent New Yorkers like Colden contributed and participated in the American Enlightenment. And I also wanted to put extra attention on the American Enlightenment in the first part of the 18th century, and Colden helped me do that. So I would say most scholarship on the Enlightenment in America has tended to focus on the second half of the 18th century, and a great deal of attention, understandably really, has been given to the Revolutionary era. So I think Colden helps us to understand what took place before then, not just in New York, but in America and in the Atlantic world more broadly.
As a lot of our discussion is going to be centered on the Enlightenment, could we discuss what the Enlightenment was? Because it seems like historians of 18th century North America and 18th century Europe like to use that term a lot.
Yeah. So what was the Enlightenment? It's one of those great questions that seems like it should have a very straightforward answer and be very easy to answer, but it's actually very difficult to come up with a simple and comprehensive response. Historians and scholars really, they spent decades, if not centuries, trying to decide what the Enlightenment was and where it started and what it stood for and who participated in it and where it began and when it ended and how it operated. And all these basic fundamental questions about the Enlightenment, I think, still remain quite unresolved and open for discussion and debate. And for me, that is one of the fascinating and exciting things about the Enlightenment. That said, I think it's quite important that we do at least take a stab at coming up with some kind of quick and useful working answer. So I'll give that a go. I would say the Enlightenment was an international and remarkable cultural shift or movement or phenomenon that probably started in the late 17th century and went all the way through the 18th century into the early 19th century. And it was marked primarily by the emphasis it put on things such as reason, science, secularism, though that's somewhat debatable, the Enlightenment was really not irreligious. It was quite compatible in many ways with religion. Cosmopolitanism and tolerance were other aspects of the Enlightenment. And perhaps most of all, I would say the Enlightenment advocated some sort of societal progress and improvement. Exactly what that was is a little vague. I mean, this is admittedly a quite vague definition of the Enlightenment. And part of the problem is that the Enlightenment was so big and it encompassed so many different attitudes and ideas and personalities, it's very hard to pin down exactly. The other part of your question is, why is the Enlightenment important? And here I think it matters because historians and other scholars have really come to think of the Enlightenment as a starting point, the birth even of the modern world. So what I would say is that we now define our modern self, our identity as modern human beings, at least in part by how we define the Enlightenment. So it's really essential that we work hard to generate something of a rich and nuanced and multifaceted and also historically accurate understanding of the Enlightenment. And I think it's also really important that we continue to think about it and discuss it and debate it.
Your description reveals that the Enlightenment was a big, broad, multifaceted idea. Was there a particular facet of the Enlightenment that Cadwallader Colden was drawn to and participated in?
That's a great question. I mean, there were several aspects that Colden contributed to. I think if you wanted to sort of pin Colden down to one Enlightenment attitude, then I think it would be that he was committed to moderation. So historians often, because the Enlightenment is so big and so broad, they divide it up. And I think it is useful to maybe break the Enlightenment into radical and moderate wings. And Colden was very much part of the moderate wing. And I would say this moderate wing looked back to much of the turmoil of the 17th century, the English Civil War and the 30 Years' War and all the destruction that those wars had wreaked in Europe. And Colden and other advocates of the moderate Enlightenment wanted a calmer, more stable, more rational order. They didn't really want revolution, but they did want progress and they wanted improvement, but they didn't want to turn over social hierarchies and destroy the church and create radical change in the way that some more aggressive members of the Enlightenment would argue for, particularly later in the 18th century.
So, why New York? When and how did Colden come to settle in New York? You mentioned that he went to the University of Edinburgh, that he trained as a physician. It seems like Colden should have had plenty of opportunities in the United Kingdom.
As I said earlier, he was very ambitious. His father was a pious and well-connected Presbyterian minister in Scotland, but he was not too wealthy, and I think Colden reacted somewhat to the modest wealth of his father, and he was determined to really go out and make his way and to achieve more money and prestige. And he was also gripped, I think, by science and the ideas that he encountered at the University of Edinburgh. So he initially decided that he was going to enter medicine, and he tried to become a physician in London, but he lacks really the wealth and the family connections to be able to do that. He had some postgraduate education, if you like, in botany and mathematics, but he never obtained a medical degree, and without that medical degree, he could not be recognized as a physician in London by the Royal College of Physicians. So he gave up quite quickly on that plan, and he moved to Philadelphia, I think because he had an aunt in the region, and she invited him over, and he tried his luck in business in Philadelphia initially. He sort of gave up on medicine for a while. And one of the really fascinating things I discovered is that when Colden was living in Philadelphia between 1710 and 1715, and he was traveling as a businessman to and from the Caribbean, he met a number of learned Scots who were doing similar sorts of things. And I think it was out of discussion with these other Scots, particularly one called Hugh Graham, who did hold a medical degree and who would go back to London and become a physician there. So in discussion with these kind of figures, Colden decided that he was going to move away from business and try to become a colonial doctor or medical practitioner. And he went back to England and Scotland and got married in 1715 and 1716. And then he came back to Philadelphia in 1716 and was quite a success. He became the leading physician in the town. There were no kind of requirements in the colonies to hold a medical degree to be a doctor in the same way that there were in London. So Colden used his sort of metropolitan connections that he he had established in London in 1715 and 1716, and he used his expertise and he presented himself as a skilled and talented and educated doctor, and his career then took off quite quickly, and he was obtaining what seemed to be quite rapid success, but then he hit a hurdle when the Pennsylvania Assembly refused to employ him as a public physician. And I think Colden at that point in 1716 said, "I've had enough of Philadelphia," and he moved to New York. He had already struck up some kind of relationship with the governor of New York, Robert Hunter, who was another educated Scotsman. And it seems that Hunter invited or tempted Colden to go to New York in 1718, and Hunter rewarded Colden with a couple of minor public positions in the Customs House and on the Chancery Court. And from that point on, Colden really started a political career that he would sustain throughout the rest of his life.
Now, Robert Hunter and his successor William Burnett were really influential in establishing a vibrant intellectual circle based in New York City during the 1720s. And I wonder if you would tell us about that intellectual circle, who participated in it, and what issues and ideas they discussed.
Yeah, I would love to, because I think this is something that has really been understudied. And the main figure here is not so much Hunter, who was an important and interesting figure, playwright and fellow of the Royal Society. I think his successor as governor, William Burnett, is really the key figure here. And William Burnett was the son of Gilbert Burnett, a famous Scottish historian. And Gilbert Burnett was an important person in the Glorious Revolution. And he was rewarded for his support of the Glorious Revolution with an appointment as a bishop, the Bishop of Salisbury in England. And in that role, Gilbert Burnett, following the Glorious Revolution in the late 1680s and 1690s, offered something of a refuge in England to Scottish Newtonians, many of whom were Episcopalians, and they were exiled from Scotland following the Glorious Revolution. So Gilbert Burnett acted as some kind of patron for these figures. And his eldest son, William Burnett, therefore grew up in England surrounded by these wonderful Scottish mathematicians who were very well versed in the latest Newtonian ideas. And William Burnett was something of a wild child. I think he went to Cambridge and he dropped out, but then his father gave him a tutor, John Craig, who seems to have stimulated William Burnett's intellectual curiosity. And William Burnett became a quite skilled and talented mathematician. He also became a protege of Isaac Newton. So when Isaac Newton moved to London, William Burnett struck up a relationship with him, and Newton helped Burnett become elected to the Royal Society. And Burnett developed his mathematics even further, and then he went on a tour of Europe, and he was welcomed in places like Switzerland and Italy as an expert on calculus. So he was regarded within Europe as an advanced mathematician. He went back then to London and he hit some financial troubles, and he decided in 1720 to take up the position of governor of New York. So he arrived in New York in 1720 with a huge library and this massive collection of scientific instruments, and he installed these in Fort George, the administrative hub, but also the residence of the governor in southern Manhattan. And during Burnett's administration, I think Fort George became a hub for this elite and quite closed intellectual clique or circle. And, I think a small number, but quite dynamic and vibrant group of New York elites gathered at Fort George, and they played chess, and they probably had some access to Burnett's library and also his scientific instruments. And Burnett was a very sociable figure, a very chatty, outgoing figure, sort of harassed them with all his ideas about scripture prophecy. This was something that he shared with Isaac Newton and something that he was very keen on. And I think this is the starting point, really, of New York intellectual culture. These were the first New York intellectuals, if you like. And Colden was very much part of that circle. And Colden was able, I think, to succeed politically because he was able to integrate himself with Burnett using his scientific interests at that time.
It sounds like Burnett brought a lot of comforts from home that were almost like curiosities in New York, his books and scientific instruments, and that when people heard about his collections, Burnett was able to turn Fort George into kind of an intellectual and scientific society.
Yes, though I would say it was very closed and very elitist, and it was very informal and unorganized. So I don't know if I would call it a society or an organization. The development of philosophical and scientific societies, I think, is something that occurs slightly later. And it's centered, of course, really in Philadelphia, with the personality of Benjamin Franklin driving much of that. But I think this kind of court circle, if you like, in Fort George is an important precursor to the development of later scientific societies. So the idea that you have this kind of polite and educated elite discussing science and philosophy in the early part of the 18th century, I think is something that we really need to pay more attention to.
What role did the New York-based intellectual circle play in the American Enlightenment? And how did their role differ from the one played by the group in Philadelphia that Benjamin Franklin belonged to?
Well, as I said, I think it was, an important precursor, but it was small and it was closed. There was not public access, for instance, to Burnett's large library, but Burnett would lend his books out to people like Colden. There were figures in the 1720s in Philadelphia, I think, are comparable to Hunter and to Burnett. And the ones I think of immediately are James Logan, another statesman, and this is someone who Colden interacted with, befriended, but then fell out with in Philadelphia between 1716 and his departure to New York in 1718. William Keith, the lieutenant governor of Pennsylvania at that time, was also another intellectual figure in Philadelphia around the time Colden was there in 1716, 1717. And these kind of elite political figures shared their ideas and shared their books. And it was the relationship really between Logan and Hunter that enabled Colden to make a smooth transition between Philadelphia and New York. So we have this sort of closed elite world at the beginning of the 18th century. And then the sort of scientific culture, philosophical culture that Franklin becomes involved with and drives later in the 18th century, in the 1730s and 1740s, was much more, I would say, artisan, a bit more public, certainly more formal, more organized. So it served a somewhat different purpose.
We've talked a fair bit about the environment Cadwallader Colden lived in, was educated in, and worked in. Let's now turn to his contributions to the Enlightenment. Would you tell us about Colden's scientific life? What types of science interested Colden, and what types of experiments did he conduct?
He had quite varied scientific interests, as I've mentioned before. He's often remembered for his botany. He was one of the first, if not the first, people in America to use the Linnaean system of botanical classification. And he also trained his daughter Jane in that method, and she became a skilled and important colonial botanist. So Jane Colden is someone who deserves a mention here. But I think Colden would have probably said botany was not his main interest. He was much more devoted to physiology or the anatomy of animals and human beings, and also to physics or natural philosophy. So these two areas, I think, overlapped for Colden. He wrote extensively for decades throughout his life, really, on the workings of animal and human bodies. He was very interested in that topic, and he conducted experiments, certainly at the beginning of the 18th century, as he tried to demonstrate and to prove that animal bodies functioned mechanically. They were like mechanisms. So they didn't operate through chemical reactions, but they were essentially explained as mechanisms. So to give you an example, probably in the early 1720s, he designed an experiment to demonstrate digestion of food was a mechanical action. And he filled some type of animal bladder with food, undigested food. And then he employed probably one of his slaves, one of his domestic slaves, to massage and to twist and to gently squeeze that bladder. In other words, the slave acted like the body surrounding the bladder. And this slave had to perform that task for about an hour. And then Colden opened up the bladder and he discovered that the food had been broken down as he expected it would be. And he wrote this experiment up and he declared that it had shown that digestion of food was a purely mechanical rather than chemical process. So he was doing these, very interesting experiments early in the 18th century that were really designed to show that human and animal bodies operated really like machines. But over time, like many British theorists, he became convinced that the body could not be fully explained as a machine. There were non-mechanical properties within animal and human bodies. And the ideas of Newton are really informing some of this thought. Newton had shown that there was this universal force of gravity that followed mathematical regularity. And Colden and others became convinced that there were also non-mechanical forces operating within human bodies and animal bodies. So around the 1740s, he moved away from his kind of strict mechanical principles and started to investigate these non-mechanical aspects of anatomy. At the same time, he became very, very interested in matter, the material world. And he became so interested in the issue of matter because he was given almost the entire entire writings of Bishop George Berkeley by his acquaintance Samuel Johnson in Connecticut. Now, Berkeley had gone to Rhode Island in the 1730s, and Samuel Johnson had befriended Berkeley, and Johnson had become really a disciple of or follower of this important British philosopher. And when Colden met Johnson around 1743, Johnson tried to convert Colden into a similar follower of Bishop Berkeley. And Colden took completely the opposite path, and he decided that Berkeley was wrong. Berkeley had said that matter did not exist. There was no philosophical proof for the existence of matter. So Colden took this as a challenge, really, and set out to prove philosophically that this thing called matter existed in the universe. And from that point, from the mid-1740s through to the end of his life, he was really determined to make an international name for himself by arguing for the existence of matter, particularly active matter. And he insisted that his description of the material world provided a very useful and a very clear and a very practical explanation of the cause of gravity. And he was extremely convinced by the notion that he had come up with this amazing philosophical find. And to his credit, he published a pamphlet on this in New York in 1744 that was then pirated and republished in London and then translated and later published in Paris and Hamburg. And then in 1751, Colden published a really quite large and grand book called The Principles of Action and Matter, and this was published in London. And it's quite a major achievement for a colonial like Colden at that point to have a major London publisher release a book of sort of speculative natural philosophy in this manner. So Colden was really breaking new ground there. Unfortunately, his ideas did not go down so well with critics. In the long run, they disappeared. But I think Colden still deserves credit, really, as a colonial author who challenged European readers to pay attention to a bold philosophical argument that had been developed in the colonies.
Colden experimented, he published, he thought about his ideas. And earlier you mentioned he laid the framework for the infrastructure that Americans used to participate in the Enlightenment. And I wonder if you would tell us more about this infrastructure and how American participation in the Enlightenment differed from European participation.
One of the very interesting things that occurred during Colden's lifetime is this acceleration of circulation of scientific and philosophical ideas and information and print culture around the Atlantic world. And Colden was certainly a participant in that to a large degree. I think he was also a driver of that change. Perhaps his most important contribution was the way in which he constructed an extensive correspondence network that linked New York to people like Benjamin Franklin in Philadelphia, also figures in other parts of British America, and it crossed the Atlantic to reach people such as Carl Linnaeus and Gronovius, these leading European botanists and naturalists. And Colden was able to generate such an extensive and important correspondence network only, I think, with the assistance of a very important figure called Peter Collinson, a Quaker merchant who lived in London. And Peter Collinson had commercial connections with New York, particularly with one of Colden's close friends in New York, James Alexander. And building on these commercial connections, Colden was able then to develop an intellectual relationship with Peter Collinson. Now, Collinson was a very active naturalist. He had a botanical garden and farm at his home in London. He's very interested in importing plant specimens from the colonies. So Colden struck up this relationship with Collinson, and Collinson became an important agent for Colden in London. So it was through Collinson that Colden was able to find London publishers for his History of the Five Indian Nations in the 1740s, for instance, an important history that Colden published, and also for his Principles of Action and Matter in 1751. So Collinson acted as an intellectual agent for Colden, but he also helped Colden's political career. So Collinson would, knock on doors of politicians and aristocrats on Colden's behalf in London during the 1740s and 1750s and 1760s. So this correspondence network that Colden generated was a very important aspect of this emergent transatlantic intellectual culture in the mid-18th century. I think another important contribution that Colden made was he thought very long and very hard about print culture. And he saw, I think, quite quickly that commercial print was circulating much more quickly around the mid-18th century Atlantic world than it had before. And he was sort of somewhat troubled by this, but I think he was also excited anchored by it. And in the 1740s, he even went so far as to develop a new printing technology that he hoped would enable the production of grand scientific works, the sort of thing that he hoped that he was going to produce. And he wanted this printing technology to act as a counterweight, so to speak, to the sort of mass publications of cheap literature and poorly developed ideas that he was worried was starting to circulate in the Atlantic world. So Colden thought very long and hard about the impact of print culture across the Atlantic in the mid-18th century, and he offered Franklin in particular a great deal of advice when Franklin was trying to get, first of all, the American Philosophical Society off the ground in the 1740s, but also some kind of scientific journal. Colden recommended, when Franklin was struggling to gain momentum for the American Philosophical Society, Colden recommended to Franklin that he concentrate instead on producing a periodical that would contain scientific essays written by colonials. So Colden, was a driver of this kind of Atlantic change, but he was also a theorizer of it. He was very interested in how this infrastructure would evolve, and he was committed to trying to make sure that this infrastructure would produce good science, what he thought was good science, and it would work to sort of raise the profile and the prestige of learned elites rather than just circulate what he saw as a bunch of cheap literature that undermined the Enlightenment, if anything.
At the start of our conversation, you told us that Colden lived a life that was intertwined with both science and politics. And now that we've had a broad overview of Colden's scientific interests, let's now take a look at his political life. Would you tell us about Cadwallader Colden, Surveyor General for the colony of New York?
The Surveyor General held a powerful position within New York because the Surveyor General was responsible for measuring out land grants. So when the governor awarded a land grant, that land grant could not be attributed to the new owner unless the Surveyor General or an agent of the Surveyor General measured it out. So Colden, as Surveyor General, had a very kind of powerful role in the distribution of land within colonial New York. And he was able to generate an income for himself from this role because he collected a fee for measuring out, for surveying all of these land grants. At the same time, he was in a very good position when it came to trying to obtain land either for himself or for his friends or for his family members. So he was able to profit individually through his position, and he became quite an extensive landowner as a result of that. Another aspect of being Surveyor General is that Colden traveled extensively, and I think this was quite an arduous task for him. He traveled extensively around the colony of New York as Surveyor General, often to quite remote places. As a result, he developed this tremendous first-hand knowledge of the colony of New York, the landscape of New York, the geography of New York, the people of New York, and the economy of New York. And he was able to use that knowledge to establish himself quite quickly in the 1720s as, I would say, the leading British expert on the history and geography of New York, and perhaps even one of the leading British experts on the history and geography of North America at that point. So he obtained that status, if you like, by producing essays and maps and eventually his History of the Five Indian Nations that documented the history and geography of New York. And much of this information was sent by Governor William Burnett in the 1720s back to government officials in London. So Colden was able then to kind of build up a reputation as something of an expert on New York and on North America in London by demonstrating his sort of knowledge that he had gained as Surveyor General at that time.
The History of the Five Indian Nations, as you mentioned, really was the publication that established Colden as an expert on the history, geography, and people of New York. Would you tell us about this publication and what it reveals about the role Colden's intellectual life played in his political life and the role that his political life played in his intellectual life?
First of all, let me say something about the History of the Five Indian Nations, because this is, a really interesting book and a really valuable book, but also quite a difficult book to understand and appreciate. And one of the reasons why it's such a tricky book, if you like, is Colden never really finished it. It was a sort of evolving, dynamic text that he started in the 1720s, and then he revised and extended in the 1740s. He even wrote a third part at some point, we're not quite sure exactly when he did that went unpublished until 1935. So this was a book that Colden Colden continued to work on, continued to think was important. But it's also really interesting because the first part of the book that Colden wrote was really tailored to a political debate that was happening in New York in the 1720s. And this debate surrounded really Governor William Burnett's imperial policies. Burnett wanted to curtail trade between New York and French Canada in goods that would then be sold on to Native Americans. Instead, and this was quite a profitable trade for many New Yorkers, so this was controversial. New York traders who made money by selling goods to French Canada were very opposed to Burnett's idea. But Burnett argued that if New Yorkers bought into his policies and they stopped selling these Indian goods to French Canada, then instead New Yorkers could profit by selling these goods either to the Iroquois or to Indian tribes who lived even further west of Iroquois. So this was Burnett's big scheme, but as I said, it proved very controversial. There was a lot of pushback from New York merchants and also from London wholesalers who supplied those New York merchants. So Burnett was embroiled in this political battle. And Colden, with his knowledge of New York and using the library that Burnett made available to him, Colden launched himself into a quite aggressive intellectual defense of Burnett's imperial policies. And the history of the five Indian nations, as it was written then in 1727 and published in New York in 1727, was primarily a statement written in support then of Burnett's plan, Burnett's scheme. It probably had quite a sort of local appeal, and it sort of vanished. Colden, even though he said he was going to continue it and he was interested in writing a second part to the history of five Indian nations, at that point he kind of set it aside in the late 1720s, in part I think because Burnett moved around that time from New York to Boston and then died quite suddenly actually in Boston in 1729. So I think Colden lost his local patron, his main reason I think for continuing with the history of five Indian nations at that point. So Colden set it to one side. But then when he started to develop this correspondence with Peter Collinson in London in the early 1740s, Colden sent Collinson a copy of his History of the Five Indian Nations, and Collinson encouraged him to write a second part, to expand it and to revise it and to extend it. And I think Collinson offered or tempted Colden to think that his book might make a bit of money. So whereas the first part of the History of Five Indian Nations had been really written for an imperial and political purpose, Colden now revised it and extended it in the 1740s because he wanted to make his name as a commercial author. And I think this speaks to the way in which that infrastructure that we've been talking about has changed quite dramatically between the 1720s and the 1740s. Colden was now aware that there was a much greater and faster circulation of print and commercial print between Europe and the Americas by the 1740s, and I think he wanted a piece of the action. So around, I think, 1741, 1742, he started to revise and extend his History of the Five Indian Nations, and then he asked Collinson to review it and to secure a publisher in London for that book. And this took Collinson some time, but eventually the book appeared in print, published in London in 1747. And it was really quite different to the book, I think, that Colden imagined he was writing, because the publisher, the printer, had really sort of taken liberties and developed the book in a quite dramatic fashion. He redirected the dedication, for instance, away from Burnett to another official who had helped him with the publication of this book. And the London printer also added a second volume of documents that he thought were related to Colden's history. So the publisher really sort of transformed Colden's book without any consultation at all, really, with Colden. And this book appeared in print in 1747, as I said, and the bookseller struggled initially to sell all of his print run. And it was only when he sold off his books to another set of London printers, and those printers repackaged it, that Colden's History of the Five Indian Nations really took off, and it then appeared in a couple of other editions in the late 1740s and early 1750s, and it became the standard Enlightenment account of the Iroquois. It was widely read by many of the most important figures of the Enlightenment in Europe, particularly by Adam Ferguson, a Scottish theorist who I think was quite influenced by Colden's history and paid a lot of attention to Colden's history. So Colden's history had this long story that speaks to the way in which Colden's political worlds and intellectual worlds really overlapped and intersected in interesting ways. A book that had started out really with a political aim or political purpose ended up being something that was really intellectual and had lost its direct and obvious political ambition or goal or aim. There's another aspect of this story that I think is worth discussing, or at least bringing up. And even though I spent a lot of time in my book exploring and examining this relationship between Colden's political life and intellectual life, Colden himself, in quite innovative ways, spent a lot of time trying to convince his contemporaries that his political life and his intellectual life were very separate things. And I think this is really, really interesting and really important. So what Colden did was he created this farm, Coldingham, and he presented in his letters this farm as an ideal space for the Enlightenment. And he said that this farm, removed from all the commercial interests and the political battles and intrigues of Manhattan and also Europe, this farm gave Colden the space and the calm and the quietness to be able to think as a wealthy, genteel, educated landowner at leisure, to think about these deep philosophical questions that were the core of the Enlightenment. So I think this is very, very, interesting, the way in which Colden tried to frame to his acquaintances and his correspondents this division between his political life and his intellectual life. And at the same time, when you look at his political life and his intellectual life, these things were very, very integrated and they overlapped considerably.
Now, 13 years after he published The History of the Five Indian Nations, Cadwallader Colden received the biggest payoff of his political career. In 1760, he was appointed the Lieutenant Governor of New York, and between 1760 and his death in 1776, Colden actually served as the acting governor of New York 4 times. John, would you tell us about Colden's experiences as lieutenant and acting governor?
Yeah, this is great, because Colden's experiences as acting governor were really quite disastrous. One of the things that really drew me to Colden was that he had this reputation in the historiography as being this inept, terrible lieutenant governor in New York in the 1760s up until his death in 1776. And he is regarded really still in the literature as being this sort of stubborn, inflexible, crown loyalist who really mismanaged things in the run-up to the American Revolution in New York. And I wanted to go back and, look at Colden and try to understand really what was driving him politically. And, I think there's a much more complicated story here that's going on. Well, one of the first things that I think we need to appreciate about Colden is that he became Lieutenant Governor of New York when he was really quite old. He was in his 70s, and most of his friends and political contacts at this point had died. His family members, his close family members, his children, and also his wife, several of them were either dead, recently dead, or ill, or about to die in 1760. So he came into office quite isolated, quite old, facing these kind of personal difficulties. And he'd also had a long history going all the way back to the 1720s of clashing with other New Yorkers, other elite New Yorkers. And this was not unusual. One thing we do know with certain about 18th century British New York was that it was full of political infighting and parties and elites battling against each other for power and for wealth and so on. So Colden was immersed in that. And so he came to New York as Lieutenant Governor in 1760, quite unexpectedly, because the previous Lieutenant Governor had died all of a sudden. So Colden even though he'd been trying to become Lieutenant Governor for a long time, he had not anticipated in 1760 that this would happen. So he came somewhat unprepared, isolated, with this long history of battling against other New Yorkers in 1760 into the office of Lieutenant Governor. And on top of that, he faced these immensely tricky political dilemmas in the run-up to the American Revolution. Some of these were caused by the death of King George in 1760. So the death of King George II in 1760 led to a dispute over the reappointment of judges, Supreme Court judges in New York. And Colden then tried to defend, in his role as acting governor, as lieutenant governor, the power of the crown by insisting that Supreme Court judges were appointed in a particular fashion. And the Supreme Court judges resisted this. So Colden was almost immediately drawn into this political battle against the legal establishment within New York. He was also under attack, I think, from a younger and rising generation of New York intellectuals. People like William Livingston and William Smith Jr., these were educated New Yorkers, but they'd been educated in the colonies, mainly at Yale University. And they were professionals, and they, I think, were quite determined to raise their own profile and to fashion themselves as a New York intelligentsia, in part by pulling Colden down. So Colden faced this attack, if you like, from this new generation of New York intellectuals. And he was ridiculed in the press. He was attacked publicly. And he struggled, frankly, to deal with that situation. And then along came the Stamp Act crisis in 1765, and this created another huge problem for Colden. He was the acting governor in New York at the moment at which the stamped paper arrived in New York Harbor. So Colden had to make a decision. He had to manage this situation. There's a great deal of public resistance, obviously, to the stamped paper and to the Stamp Act. At the same time, Colden felt bound to follow British law, to follow Crown instructions. So he did his best, I think, but it was an extremely difficult situation for him. And the other situation, I think, that sort of limited Colden at this moment was that by this time he had developed this great concern, fear, anxiety, if you like, about the partisanship and the demagoguery and the inflammatory politics that he saw developing and circulating in pre-revolutionary New York. And I think this is one aspect of the moderate Enlightenment, of Colden's Enlightenment, I think that is important, because Colden, really operating within the Enlightenment framework as he saw it, was resistant to the Stamp Act revolt, which he saw as being sort of harkening back to the disorder and the chaos of the 17th century, of the English Civil War and so on, the sort of thing that the Enlightenment was meant to be moving away from. So I think there is a case to say that Colden, through his Enlightenment beliefs, was really sort of limited and unable to kind of appreciate the situation and to navigate the situation of the Stamp Act crisis in 1765. So, he ended up being confined to Fort George while a mob in November 1765 attacked him, destroyed his property, and really threatened his life. This was, a deep traumatic moment, I think, for Colden, but he managed to survive and to get through that. And then he spent really the last decade or so of his life really complaining in his letters back to London about how the lawyers in New York and other elites in New York had been or were encouraging this kind of mobbish mentality that would ultimately bring chaos and disorder to New York and to British America more generally.
It sounds like Colden's time as lieutenant and acting governor didn't go so well. When you look at his career as a whole, what do you see as his legacy, John? Has Cadwallader Colden left any lasting impact on our present-day world?
That is a really good and interesting question. I mean, I would say his scientific and philosophical ideas really do not have much of a legacy at all. They've not lasted too well. But then again, I wonder really, how many ideas in the natural sciences developed, in Colden's time period have really lasted into the present day. His politics also, I think, were probably too elitist and royalist to have much relevance for today. Though I think, it might be perhaps interesting to think about the value of his objection to the kind of demagoguery and inflammatory politics that he saw developing in New York in the middle of the 18th century and in the run-up to the American Revolution. Colden's History of the Five Indian Nations, I think that really remains a valuable and interesting book and a source on Native American history. That said, I think any readers of that book today need to pay attention and think critically, read it with care, because it does present a somewhat biased and distorted view of the history of the five Indian nations. Overall, though, I would say Colden's main legacy is probably to do with that idea of a scientific infrastructure that allowed American philosophical and scientific and intellectual culture to really develop rapidly in the middle of the 18th century. So his correspondent networks, his interest in print, this sort of advice he gave to Franklin and others about the development of institutions like the American Philosophical Society, I think that was really important. I think that gets at the essence of Colden's historical legacy, if you like. And I would say, if I can throw out one final thing as well, that Colden was something of an innovator and an investor in British America, in America. He was very keen to see an improvement in the development of American land, for instance. And he's sometimes recalled as being a forerunner of the Erie Canal. He built a small canal on his farm in Ulster County, and he also wrote quite extensively about the commercial potential of New York's waterways. So I think there's something to be said that maybe Colden had a role or significance in the making of New York as an empire state, and also perhaps in the sort of development of the American landscape, so to speak.
It's time for the Time Warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently.
The Time Warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
In your opinion, what might have happened if Cadwallader Colden had not been appointed Surveyor General of New York? How would the lack of this political office, with its decent salary, have affected Colden's contributions to the Enlightenment?
I would say that Colden probably would have left New York pretty quickly in the early 1720s if he felt that his pathway to political and social advancement was blocked. After all, he moved on from Philadelphia pretty quickly, so I think he probably would have moved on from New York pretty quickly if he felt that he was not going to make his way, become a gentleman and achieve sort of wealth and prestige there. So I guess that poses another question, which is where would Colden have gone if he had left New York in the early 1720s? I don't think he would have carried on up to Boston because he really regarded New Englanders as being a bit too Republican for his taste. So I suspect he probably would have gone back to Philadelphia. And that in itself raises this very interesting situation where we might have had Colden and Franklin living together in Philadelphia in the 1730s and 1740s. And then I guess we can speculate on what would have happened if Colden and Franklin had become neighbors and perhaps even partners and co-workers and collaborators in this scientific experiments and discussions in the middle of the 18th century. That would have been a real interesting situation, I think. I suspect Colden, because he was, almost 20 years older than Franklin, because he was more educated, maybe Colden would have been the more dominant figure in such a partnership. Who knows? Perhaps, Liz, you would have ended up with a podcast called Coltons World instead of Benjamin Franklin's World if Colden had ended up in Philadelphia.
Cadwallader Colden's World. That doesn't exactly roll off the tongue now, does it? It's kind of a mouthful.
Yeah.
So while we let the idea of what a hypothetical partnership between Ben Franklin and Cad Colden would have looked like simmer in the back of our minds, why don't you tell us what you're researching and writing about now?
I'm moving in a somewhat different direction. I've just completed a year-long research fellowship at the Goldstein Gorin Center for American Jewish History at New York University. And I've used that research fellowship to move forward my latest book project, which is a history of Jews in the early modern Atlantic world. And I read in this book because, Jews, they really don't feature very heavily at all in most accounts of early American history. But I'm convinced that they played a, really crucial role in the development of transatlantic commercial and cultural connections between Europe, Africa, and the Americas in the 16th and 17th and 18th centuries. So I want to write a book that tells that story. And, it's a really exciting and very enjoyable project that pulls together a lot of great recent research on Jews in such places as West Africa, South and Central America, and the Caribbean, as well as, of course, in British America.
John, where should we look for more information about you and how we can contact you to pose more questions about Cad Colden, the American Enlightenment, or early New York politics?
You can find out more information about me through the College of Staten Island City University of New York website. I have a faculty page there that you can look up and get a little bit more information about me from. And then you can contact me via email at john.dixon@cuny.edu. So john.dixon@cuny.edu.
John Dixon, thank you for helping us get a sense of the American Enlightenment and for introducing us to Cadwallader Colden.
Thank you, Liz.
Our conversation with John revealed that the Enlightenment wasn't one movement, event, or idea. The Enlightenment encompassed many different movements, events, and ideas. And through the life of Cadwallader Colden, we've been able to see and gain a better understanding of some of the different aspects of the Enlightenment. Aspects such as science, politics, and what we'd now call geography and anthropology. Plus, Colden's work to establish a transatlantic exchange network reveals how Enlightenment participants communicated and shared their ideas even across the Atlantic Ocean. Cadwallader's life and participation in the Enlightenment also provides us with a window onto colonial New York history. A critical reading of his History of the Five Indian Nations gives us a sense of what New York looked like geographically and demographically during the early to mid-18th century. And the time he spent as Surveyor General and as Lieutenant and Acting Governor also gives us a window onto how colonial New York politics operated. You can find more information about John, his book, The Enlightenment of Cadwallader Colden, plus everything we talked about today on the show notes page, benfranklinsworld.com/109. If you enjoyed today's discussion, you should definitely visit the show notes page or check out benfranklinsworld.com/Cornell. Cornell University Press, our episode sponsor, helped John publish The Enlightenment of Cadwallader Colden, and they're offering you the chance to purchase his book at a 30% discount. That's pretty awesome. I'm really grateful to Cornell University Press, not only for offering us this special private sale, really, how cool is that, but for their support of Ben Franklin's World in general. Not only have they sponsored this episode, but their books have provided us with great episode topics in the past and will continue to do so going forward. Finally, what do you think would have happened if Ben Franklin and Cadwallader Colden had been friends and neighbors? Do you think our memory of Benjamin Franklin would be the same? Send your answers to liz@benfranklinsworld.com, tweet me @LizCovart, or post a comment on the show notes page or in our listener community on Facebook.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.